right, my little gardeners, I'm going to go over the plant nomenclature chapter in the National Junior Horticulture Association textbook. So we're going to cover nomenclature, and you might think that's a really boring chapter, but it's not, because it's a foundation of everything that you need to know in horticulture. So what does nomenclature mean? It's the choosing of names or the assigning of names. And it's a perfect systematic design of naming designed by a Swedish botanist. So we're going to talk about his name, because you have to know his name and you have to know this vocabulary word. But you're also going to have to know another vocabulary word, and that's taxonomy. Taxonomy is the branch of science where we put things into groups. Taxonomy, the branch of science where we put them into little groupies in this systematic system. So let's talk about where this system came from. You can imagine the value of having a naming system. When plants were used medicinally, and some of them are poisonous, you needed to know the poisonous ones from the healthy ones. And when you have different people in different cultures using different common names, there was a whole lot of confusion. Plus the system under Plato and Aristotle, they would take a plant like this Dracaena that we know, and they would call it by its descriptive words. They might say parallel veined, spotted leaves, and it would be this long descriptive word, short, all kinds of words on it. That got to be too cumbersome of a system. And because it was too lengthy of a name, all these organisms in the world, they had to be a better system. So there was a gentleman who was a Swedish doctor, and he wanted to get involved more in the systematic naming of the plants, and he designed this system that's now currently used throughout the world. His name is Carolus Linnaeus, and he designed a system that we're going to look at over here. It's kind of like a big old funnel, and he put all the organisms of the world into this little funnel system. So every organism living, whether it was a plant or an animal, got put into a kingdom. And in school you're probably studying, there's about 5 kingdoms that we often study, things like protists and other organisms, but plant and animal are the 2 really big kingdoms. And this is what Carol Linnaeus did. And then it goes kingdom, division, class, order, family, and as you work your way down, it gets more specific, describing the individual plant, till you get to the very bottom, genus, species, and we call this the scientific names. We're going to talk about some of the rules, but these are called scientific names. We call them botanic names. There's lots of words for this. So that's how he designed the system. So when he designed this system, there had to be some rules. So since the time that he designed the system, it's been modified a lot. But in the year of 1753, there was an organization established called the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. Remember, nomenclature means naming. So this organization was responsible for this new naming system. They had some very specific rules. They used the Latin language. Latin was used because it was, currently it's a dead language, so it doesn't change. Nobody speaks it. So nobody's creating any slang language like mouse, back when I grew up, always meant a little gray thing that crawled around. But nowadays, mouse can refer to computer things. But Latin's a dead language, so there's no slang. So that's one of the rules. All the names are Latinized. And here's another fun fact. Carolus Linnaeus, that's not his real name. His real name was Carl von Linné. And when he designed this Latinized naming system, he Latinized his own name. So it became Carolus Linnaeus. So that's just a fun fact that might help you remember Carolus Linnaeus. You better know him for the test questions. So one of the rules is all your names are Latinized. And then when we get to the bottom of the funnel over here, the genus name is always capitalized with a big letter, always. So I capitalized the G for genus here. The species, which is a plural word, is always descriptive. Like you don't have to know many Latin names, but there's plants that are called like Quercus alba, and alba means white. Or you might know Spigelia marylandica. Well, that means Maryland, so the plant's from Maryland. So the species is always descriptive in some way. Both of the scientific names are either italicized or underlined, which you'll have to know how to do that in our botanical test. And then I have on here, everything's Latinized. So this organization keeps all the names in the whole world. Every animal, every plant has a scientific name, and we use scientific names all the time. So let's look at Carol Linnaeus' system here. We already said kingdoms, the two big ones are plants and animals. Then it breaks down. In the plant world, we use the next category as division. In organisms like animals, they'll say kingdom, phylum, and break down. But in plants, we call it division is the next grouping. Then you jump down to classes. Every plant is put in a kingdom, in a division, and in a class. But we have to stop here because there's a huge breakdown in this plant naming system. And there's two big groups called gymnosperms and angiosperms. And I'm going to introduce you to Angie. Here's Angie. They're all the flowering plants of the world. And when we talk about flowering plants, we'll study later on. There's 4 main parts to every flower. And we know petals is one of them, but it doesn't have to be present. But there's always the male and the female parts and sepals and petals. So Angie is always a flower. That's a huge classification breakdown under the grouping of class. The other one is Jim, and he's a gymnosperm. And all gym, now look at the word here. Notice I write it like gym class, G-Y-M. They're called gymnosperms. And gym is always a cone. So I put eyeballs on a big old fat cone from a tree. This is plants like, you have to know yew on your list, or things like hemlock, or of course the easy ones like pine trees that make cones. So all the cone plants, the flowers have a different, they don't have the petals that we typically think of angiosperms. So that's a big breakdown of different types of classes. And then it breaks down again. Let me show you another grouping. You know how when you eat a bean and you moisten it, it breaks into 2 pieces like this? There's a subclass that are called diacots. Diacots. It's a word you have to be familiar with. And there's specific characteristics of diacots. So I've listed on here, here's some plants that you know. Magnolias, all of our oaks, all of our roses, and our beans. And what happens to diacots? Well, diacots always have 2 cotyledons in the seed. I have that listed as the number 1 characteristic. The little embryonic plant always has 2 sections, just like a bean breaks into 2 seeds. Their flower parts are always in multiples of 4s and 5s. Their veins are reticulated, meaning they're net veined. We're going to look at the other grouping, which has parallel veined. So reticulated means network of veins. And we often know this grouping of plants because they become very woody and they can make bark. And the bark produces secondary wood over and over. Your perennial plants that die every year, they don't make this secondary growth. So that's one big group called diacots. And the other big subclass is called monocots. You have to be familiar with both of these. Monocots, I made it into a piece of grass because why? Monocots always have parallel veins. All of your grasses, all of your corn, and I listed the plants you have to know. Lilies are all monocots. Lilies, grasses, corn, and the Dracaena plants that you have to know. They all have this characteristic parallel veins. So here's the breakdown of the characteristics. The embryo, if you've ever germinated a piece of corn, it just has 1 embryo and it sprouts from there. The flowers are in multiples of 3s. So if you have stamens, there's either 3, there's 6, there's 9. If you've got petals, they're either 3, 6, 9, or more. And the veins are always parallel. And most often these plants do not produce any kind of woody secondary growth. They tend to be more herbaceous perennials or biennials. So monocots and diacots both come into a subclass section under Carolus Linnaeus' system. So every plant in the world fits into this. As we come down here into the group of family, this is really important for plants. This is where we really begin to break out into different characteristics. So families are often used, and in our plant world, they always end in A-C-E-A-E. A-C-E-A-E. So your family might be Lily ACE or Magnolia ACE. And we have to know mince, and that's another class, I forget how to pronounce it, Labidaceae. So that's a big category. And then you get down to the very bottom of Linnaeus's system as the genus species. So let's see, what other facts do we have to know about our genus species? We talked about the rules. Now, sometimes plants like dogwoods that live in Florida are different than the dogwoods that live up through Connecticut and Maine, even though that's an East Coast plant. So within that, you have dogwoods that like cooler climates. But the dogwoods that live in Florida, you can't grab them and move them to Maryland. So they have the same genes and they have the same scientific name, but they're a different form. So sometimes within the genus species, you might see us use the word form. And that means naturally occurring plants that occur in the wild naturally. There's even a grouping of dogwoods that were pink, and they found them in the Catoctin area, and somebody grabbed those pink ones and started to cultivate them, and you can buy them in stores now. You can buy pink dogwoods, even though that's not the natural Cornus Florida plant. So that's one of the characteristics of a dogwood, that you get a little geographical change, maybe because they're in Florida and they like heat, and the ones in Maine like cold, or maybe the pink ones that they found in Maryland and somebody pulled them and sold them. But what also happens in our nurseries is sometimes there's a plant that has outstanding characteristics, and somebody says, I love that plant. Like, I worked in a greenhouse, and the guy found a poinsettia that had all kinds of specks on its leaves. And he said, that is so pretty. He spent 10 years breeding that poinsettia with the little spots all over it. He cultivated it, and he called her Jingle Bells. So that's another name that sometimes is given. We call these cultivars. Cultivars. And that means it's cultivated by a human. By me. I'm just going to say me. But that means by a person. So cultivars, and whenever you write a cultivar, it'll always have the little quotation marks on it. A little quote. Or it might say, there's 3 ways. I should write this down for you. Let me show you on the board here. Cultivars. They can write CV, like if I told you he named his Jingle Bells. So we can say Jingle Bells, and you can put the little lines up there, or you can just write Jingle Bells and put the little quote. It's just a single quotation mark. So there's different ways to write your cultivar, but that always means it's not just the plain old native species. It means somebody grabbed it away and cultivated it inside of those in their nursery. So there's the overall view. Did I tell you the word binomial? This genus species name is called a binomial system. Binomial means 2 names. What are the 2 names? The genus is like your last name, because it's like if I call my house and they ask for Joyce, or you might want to get my husband, whose name is Mike. So there's 2 of them. The species name is more like my first name, like Joyce. And it's a very descriptive word. So it's called a binomial system, 2 names. So there you go. There's the chapter on plant nomenclature with some vocabulary words you need to know.